So recently I did a video called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, which was a book review by Michael Grieber, I believe. And you can see that video in the card above. And it's been really well received. I've had a lot of incredible comments about it. And there aren't a lot of solutions necessarily in that video, unfortunately. And unfortunately, when you get into the realm of debt, there aren't a lot of great solutions yet, which is why it behooves us to start thinking about these issues and how to solve them. Unfortunately, when you get into the solutions mode with regards to debt, you end up realizing the sheer scale of the system that we live within in terms of the financial system and how tightly bound up with debt it actually is. You also realize that debt's not actually the problem, it's the scale of the debt that's really the issue. And it's that scale that forces us to work with trust agencies like banks, lawyers, and other systems, so that when we're transferring massive sums of money, that there's an intermediary that allows for that trust mechanism, whereas before that trust mechanism would have been held in community. That worked up to a certain scale, at which point it just kind of fell apart. So there are some solutions, I think, to the debt crisis that we find ourselves in. It's kind of this ongoing, looming crisis, and nobody really knows when the system's just going to implode. But it does require some massive changes, and because we're so dependent on debt, the changes that are made end up having to be very strategic and specific. And of course, when you start making those changes, you probably end up threatening certain people's livelihoods, either people that have made investments into a system that depend on the perpetual growth of debt, which could be a class of people like baby boomers, or the actual architects of the system themselves. And so while the system itself is eating the planet, which we all depend upon, the people that are behind the consumption of the planet are unwilling to change, because the benefits that that system brings to them is so great that it's in their best interest to keep it running. And so a lot of the solutions end up becoming sidesteps, essentially. So they're smaller adjustments that help individuals that want to remove themselves from that system make those steps on their own. Probably one of the easiest steps that you can make that costs very little is just to consume less and to produce more. And that was kind of the whole premise behind Mollison's thesis in permaculture, was that if only a small percentage of us became producers as opposed to consumers, a lot of these problems would disappear. But as our society becomes more fractured and we become more specialized and more siloed in our own professions, we become more dependent on all of the other silos, which forces us to earn more money and go back out into the economy and generate that money so that we can go and pay money to each of these other silos, professions, whatever you want to call them, whether it's dentists, engineers, architects, doctors, farmers. And so the idea is that if we start to become more self-reliant within our communities and scale those professions down so that we recognize that we need everybody in equal amounts, that we can start to create our own local economies. One of the big issues with moving away from this debt-based system, though, is still land. And so there's kind of two ideas that I've been throwing around in my head for many years now, and one of which I want to talk about today, and then the other one we'll talk about in a future video, but I'll briefly mention both of them. So one of the ideas that I've been contemplating is how to get the benefits of having access to land without necessarily having the massive cost associated with it. And so I've had this idea for a long time called Homestead in a Box, which is what we're going to talk about today. In order for that to work, though, we need to sort out the land access component. And so land is typically one of the most expensive pieces of a homestead, and depending on where you choose to live is going to depend on how much that land costs per unit of area, whether it's acres or hectares. And there's a whole bunch of solutions around land access that we'll talk about in a future video, and I've actually written about them, and I'll put a link to a couple of them down below, specifically I can't remember the name of the blog, but I think it was like Small Town Retrofit or something like that, which was a very popular blog on my Virtual Permaculture website. But today I want to talk about this concept of a homestead in a box. And while I'm talking, there's going to be illustrations of this homestead in a box kind of coming in as B-roll, so you'll kind of get a sense of what it could look like. It doesn't have to look like this, and in fact any homestead in a box has to be modified to accommodate for the bioregion. And so every bioregion is going to have different constraints, whether it's got lots of rain, or whether it's really cold, whether it's really hot, whether it's really dry, or a combination thereof. And so we were looking at partnering on a piece of property not that long ago, and because there was no homes there, I really kind of got my idea into this homestead in a box concept, and I kind of wanted to build something that was super portable, so in the event that we did buy our own land and we wanted to move our infrastructure off the property, it could be disassembled, placed into a container, and then moved onto the other property and then reassembled again in mass rapidity. And so we might have to do that 2 or 3 times in our life, and so why not make this very quick? And so typically the first structure that comes to mind for folks is a yurt. A yurt goes up really quick and it goes down really, really quickly. But there's a lot of disadvantages with yurts. And I've done a video, which I'll link to in this card, specifically on yurts that you can watch if you're interested in buying a yurt and you want to understand some of the things that I think about when we're talking about yurts. So I thought, well, why not combine the benefits of multiple different systems and see what that looks like. And so I designed this homestead in a box, which was basically 2 yurts on the end, a shipping container with kind of the guts of the system in the middle, things that you don't necessarily want to tear down and bring back up again, things like bathrooms, the mechanical room, a shower, toilet, depending on what kind of toilet you want, the kitchen, and the dining room. And so you build this kind of the heart of the system into a shipping container so that everything's bolted down and can be shipped, but there's enough room still in there so that you can fit everything else inside of it. So when the yurts come down, because they would abut to this shipping container, they all get slipped into the shipping container itself, and then a truck can come along, pick the shipping container off, and move it on to the next site. So 2 yurts, a shipping container, and then off the front a removable passive solar greenhouse. And so now you've got your food production system and season extension. You've also got additional living space in the passive solar greenhouse. You've got 2 sleeping quarters, or sleeping quarters and an office, or some variation thereof. You've got a really nice and usable kitchen in the shipping container. You've got a really nice and usable bathroom. And you've got a functional mechanical system which can move the air around the system, which is one of the big problems in structures like yurts and in shipping containers. And so a small little heat recovery ventilator. Maybe you've even got a small little central heating system in there, depending on how you choose to heat the space. And if it was designed properly, all of these structures could sit on screw piles. And so in a perfect world, you'd even have access to the screw piles, and as soon as you arrived on site, you'd hire a bobcat with the right hydraulic motor, and you would punch the screw piles in, place all the infrastructure, and in very short order, like less than a week, you'd have your entire home set up. What's really great about this is that agricultural land is typically very inexpensive to rent. So in Alberta, it's anywhere from $50 to $100 an acre per year. And if you've already purchased all the infrastructure, like this homestead in a box, then all you're doing is renting an acre of land, let's say, for $50 to $100 a year. You might have to import water into a tank. Hopefully your system's got a rainwater harvesting system. Or maybe you even have to put a well in because you've got a 5 to 10 year lease and you can amortize the cost of a well over that period of time. But in reality, your cost of living ends up being really low, and if the yurts are designed properly and the shipping container is designed properly, you could theoretically see this thing up in the Arctic, all the way down to the west coast of Canada, and maybe even further south as well, as long as you've kind of thought about the thermodynamics and how it's going to fare within that bioregion. And so now, instead of coming up with $500,000 for a property, maybe you only have to come up with $100,000, and you're not stuck to living in a tiny house, which is only a couple hundred square feet, but you've actually got about 1,000 square feet between the 2 yurts, the shipping container, maybe 2,000 square feet by the time you've put the passive solar greenhouse on the front. And so you've got a fairly decent living space now without having to pay that $300 to $400 a square foot for a structure. And so this was really appealing to me, and that's why I made this video about it. So this potentially solves one problem, which is the cost of housing, and allows people to be a little bit more mobile and to take control of their monthly living expenses, because the system ideally would also harvest electricity and rainwater and process your waste with composting toilets, and you'd have gardens around here and all that stuff. But when it comes to the land part, you're still dependent on somebody leasing that land to you. And that might be easy depending on where you live, but the land piece is the part that we have to think a little bit more about. And one of the models that I've heard about, which we're going to talk about in a future video, is this concept of a land cooperative, where a cooperative is formed, cooperative of people, and they all invest into the cooperative financially by buying shares in the cooperative, and then the cooperative goes out and it acquires agricultural land and it regenerates it. And as a result of doing that, the land appreciates in value, and because the land needs a manager, local or not local people are brought in to manage that land in a regenerative way and given long-term tenure. So we would write things like 99-year leases where the farmer could allow the next generation to basically come onto that property and live there as long as they were managing it in a regenerative way. So we're going to have a conversation about that in a future video, about land cooperatives and how to change the way that we currently look at land. And I think that any change in how we look at land is also going to have to come with a change of buildings. And so instead of getting caught up on this homestead in a box and yurts and shipping containers, because a lot of people are very pedantic about what they like and what they don't like, which is great. It's important that you know what you want and what you don't want. Don't get caught up on the materials or the systems that I've talked about here. Use it more as a metaphor to think about other ways that you could create your own homestead in a box. I'm curious if you can leave your comments and ideas on what a homestead in a box might look like in the comment section below. And maybe we can do more videos on different systems that kind of incorporate this mass ability to move, kind of like a modern day gypsy in a sense, with a little bit more comfort, essentially. So leave that in the comment section below. If you found that useful, give us a like. And one way that you can support the channel, it takes a lot of effort to keep these channels going, and obviously we're giving this information out for free, is by buying our t-shirts. And so we have a shirt store just below the video there, and you can get access to all sorts of funny shirts that we build on Teespring. And we'd love for you to pick one up and let me know how you like it. And we'll see you guys in the next video.